Hey Megan, how you doing? All right, let's go ahead and take a look. I was reading your writing here. I think everything you're saying here is making really good sense. You're talking about depth, dimension, and volume, and I think that's really, really important in any illustration. When you're illustrating, those words should be in your mind. Depth, dimension, volume. Depth, dimension, volume. How can we establish? How can we increase these elements associated with any? I'm sorry about that. My dog's over there. That's what that noise you're hearing. So sorry about that. A little distracting, I know. Anyways, I'm so super pleased to hear you talking about these elements that point to depth, dimension, and volume. Let's take a look. I think the wonderful thing about this poster is its subtlety. And it's delivered beautifully. I love the color palette. I think the color palette's very, very soft, which of course points to the art form. Ballet is a very soft art form. I wouldn't call it a feminine art form at all, but I would definitely say that use of feminine color palettes could be very effective. In this case, you're using very, very light hues, not a lot of contrast. As a matter of fact, I think one thing that we can improve here a little bit is the contrast associated with this piece. But we're going to tackle that through typography. I love the illustration. I want you to keep working on it. You've handled these little subtle gradients in a beautiful way. Really, really good. You're showing excellent restraint here. A couple of things I would like to see is I'd like to see you continue working on this depth, dimension, and volume. And one of the things I want you to experiment with, I'm not real sure. Well, actually, the first thing I want to mention is this. Okay, so these little contact shadows right here are these little shadows right here. Sorry about that. These little cast shadows right here. I think they're good, but I think they're too small. Okay, think of right now, this looks like it's just like a little ripple of like when you touch water and it creates that little ripple. And that kind of reminds me of that right there. The cast shadow itself, now the shadow and this little gradient of the, you said with the light, that's indicating what? It's indicating a light source that is coming directly above, somewhere up here, right? Here is this light source here, and then this little cast shadow here is also depicting the light source as being above about 12 o'clock on the actual composition. The issue is that there's going to be a lot going on. Right now, there's already a lot going on. I mean, this shadow would come out straight up here. If the light source were at 12 o'clock, this shadow would be a lot bigger. What I would recommend that you do is just to soften that shadow a little bit. I think because I'm going to ask you to increase the size of that shadow. And it's going to create some problems because what's going to end up happening is this shadow is going to start running into this shadow. So you have to try to figure out how you're going to depict those shadows in a very realistic way. It might entail creating one shadow as opposed to two shadows, right? It might entail just increasing this, but really bringing down the transparency. So experiment there, but keep in mind that this may indicate another shadow. Another option is to keep these little contact shadows the way they are, okay? But maybe increase or add another kind of an irregular shaped shadow on the floor right from here down in between this area here and this area here, just to kind of indicate that there is more above here that would be creating the shadow. Okay, does that make sense? Another thing that you want to experiment with is further development of depth, dimension, and volume by using additional shading techniques as opposed, not gradients. I think the gradients are great, but using other solid hue shading and highlight techniques. And those are specifically, you can take a look at those if you jump over to the course announcements area right over here. Just jump to the course announcements. You take a look at week 3 announcement. I've got a couple of tutorials in here on creating shadows and highlights and create shading and coloring vector illustrations. So take a look at those and also take a look at realism of vector illustrations and then flexible shading and highlight effects. So try those and see if you can get some ideas as how to you might even improve the depth, dimension, and volume more here. Okay, as I said before, I think the one thing I would have to say is if there's something missing from this piece, it's contrast. And contrast is something, again, that as a designer, that word should constantly be in your mind when you're working. As a matter of fact, there's a principle in design called CRAP, C-R-A-P, CRAP. If you want to be politically correct, you could call it CARP, but it's C-R-A-P. And what it is contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. What that says is contrast is a super important element in designs. We have to make sure that we have a proper contrast. Alignment, make sure things are in alignment. Right now, it looks like we're in alignment here. I'm going to grab this little guy right here, and I just want to bring this over. And it looks right now like, yeah, that's right in alignment, but it appears not to be because of the way that the meat of the T is kind of aligned with that tiny little hairline serif of the end. It makes it look like the T is pushed over to the left a little bit. What I would do is just nudge that T, nudge the word the over a little bit to the right. When I say a little bit, I mean 2 or 3 pixels. Also, decrease the space between the T and the H and the E. That's called kerning, and that kerning is too wide right there. Additionally, you may consider bringing the closer to the nutcracker. That would be called proximity, because what we want the viewer to completely understand is the is associated with nutcracker and not with the sword. Okay, so by bringing that down, I'm not so concerned about the way the sword is going to hit the nutcracker. I wouldn't bring the sword down anymore, just bring this down a little bit. Maybe the bottom of the sword can align with the top of the nutcracker. Speaking of kerning, I think this space right here is a little too wide. I think this one is not, it's still too wide, not as bad as this. I would bring that a lot closer to the little nutcracker dude, and this one just a little bit closer. Then finally what I would do is I would take the words the and nutcracker, and I would try to get that darkness right there. I know that hue right there is created more by a texture than by the actual presentation of the hue, as we can see right there. That's a texture. But if that were a basic hue, I would try to duplicate that hue. It's not quite black, but it is a lot darker than the nutcracker here. And I would change the hue of the nutcracker and the word the and the nutcracker to something that's a little closer to that dark, while keeping the contact information the same color. Okay. All right. I know I just gave you a lot to think about, so you may have to look at this video more than once while you're working, but really consider my recommendations here. And I do want to say this is just gorgeous. It's coming along beautifully. And I do recommend this quite a bit, just for giggles and grins. Take your very first iteration of the poster, place it next to this one, and you'll be astounded at the improvements that have been made just in the last few days. All right, fantastic. Any questions at all, please don't hesitate to let me know. All right, great job. Thanks.